Hello and welcome to the Leadership Edge. I'm your host, Ted Gorski. The focus of this show is to really help you develop future leadership skills, not only in you, but in the people that you lead. As I mentioned, my name is Ted Gorski. I am president and an executive and leadership coach from Get Your Edge, in which we help leaders develop their leadership skills. And today's show is very, very interesting. It's one of my favorite topics. As you can see in front of me, I have a bunch of books, and I've done a lot of reading. It's been keeping me busy, but one of the things that I wanted to share in today's show is the 10 secrets of great leaders. And it's the whole concept of success leaves tracks. In today's show, we're going to talk about some of the leaders that I've studied and kind of how it all came about to create this particular topic and this speech about the 10 great leaders. Now, my leadership whole journey in terms of this kind of research really started one day when I was in my office. And I sat back in my chair and I looked up in the bookcase. And I am an avid sports fan, and I noticed that I had a lot of the great coaches' books in my bookshelves. And I said to myself one day, what do these leaders have in common? What have they done to be so successful? Now, it started off with, of course, sports coaches. I researched Vince Lombardi, all the way down to our beloved coach here in New England, Bill Belichick. And I read books about them and their leadership style. And I started to develop this huge whiteboard with all their leadership tips. But what I found out very interesting is as I researched each of these sports leaders, they actually started talking about other leaders that they studied. And as you can see in the right-hand side of this screen with the list of leaders, it started going into the business world and even the political world. And what was quite fascinating as I researched those particular leaders, I actually found out some great characteristics that were quite common that they used in their leadership style. So my journey, which started off as just sports coaches, actually then turned into other particular leaders in the business and political arenas. And what I'm going to discuss in today's show is what each of these leaders have as their core competency and foundations, and how you can use some of these in your leadership style. Because as I said earlier, success leaves tracks. And we can argue about these particular leaders, but there's one thing we can say, is that these leaders were quite successful in their field and their craft. So what we're going to do today is really discuss what I consider the 10 secrets. Now, what I'm going to do here is just roughly go through them, and then we're going to go through each one individually to help you not only understand the concepts that these leaders bring to the table regarding these areas, but also some stories which highlight their success. First one is open communication, which means the concept of always being available to communicate. And this was really vital with all the leaders that I actually researched in this. What I also found is that they were great listeners, not only to the point of listening to the message, but also understanding from body language what their message is. I noticed that a lot of them used humor, very self-deprecating humor. And as we discuss this point in general, I'll talk a little bit more about some of this stuff that they did. All of them had an accountability mindset, and they also realized the power of recognition and praise in the people that were around them. Moving on to number 6, all of them were quite flexible in terms of their plans, but they also had the unique ability to change their plan on the fly. And this allowed them to be quite successful because things are quite dynamic, not only in the sports world, but in the business and political world. What I also found that each of them were quite good teachers. They were people that really taught people well and understood the power of teaching others. And we're going to talk more in that in depth as we talk about that point. Each one had the ability to understand individual capabilities. What each person that they were working with had as a skill set to help them to establish and help them develop their success. Number 9 was building relationships. Each person had the ability and the uncanny ability to build relationships around them. And lastly, it's all about the team. Each of these individuals really focused on the power of the team and they focused on what was important to the team. So what we're going to do today's show is we're going to go through each of these individually to really discuss these a little bit in depth in the short time that we have, and the importance for you to think about as we discuss these particular categories, which one of these do you think you need to develop for your future leadership success? And this, again, is great for people who are in current leadership positions, but young adults who may be on sports teams, what they can do as leaders on their sports teams to be even better leader than they are today. So let's transition and talk about secret number one, open communication. What was quite interesting with this particular characteristic in this secret is that each leader had the uncanny ability to be open and to be available to communicate with their people. Winston Churchill, one of the things he used to do was talk to the people on the front line. Now, Winston Churchill was the Premier of England, and he was the person that was really running the war for England. What he wanted to do was really talk to his troops, and he would go to the front lines and have some open communication with them to find out how it was going from their perspective. He didn't listen to his subordinates. He wanted to hear it from the troops. And the troops would be very open to him of what they needed to be successful. And guess what Winston Churchill did? The next day, those soldiers had it. He had the uncanny ability to really be open in his communication. He didn't want to hear the fluff. He wanted to know what was actually happening, to keep a pulse. Effective leaders understand that power. They understand when they say they're open, they must show that. It's the old walk the talk concept. Are you open in your communications? Are you willing to take those particular words from people that may not be the best, but have that ability to communicate with them? Each of these leaders had that uncanny ability to be able to be open and flexible. Our second point is good listeners. Now, when we talk about good listeners, we not only talk about listening for the message, but also watching what people are saying. It's the whole concept of active listening. One of the things that we're taught as coaches in the very beginning is understanding the concept of being a great listener. It's not only listening to what is said, but also what's not being said. It's also listening to how it's being said by looking at someone's body language. If someone says, "Yeah, I agree with that," their body language is screaming, "That is full of bunk." And we as active listeners have to really catch that. All these leaders had that ability to also listen to the message, but also watch the message. So it's the old 80-20 rule, listening 80% of the time, speaking 20% of the time. That's how we're taught as coaches. So in a typical 30-minute coaching session, I'm actually talking 6 minutes of the time, asking those vital questions. So let's test your listening skills. I'm going to tell you a short story. Now, I don't want you to write anything down. I'm going to say the story. It's a short paragraph, but I want you to be able to answer the two questions that I have at the end. You ready? You are the bus driver for the Park Lane Elementary School in Leawood, Kansas. Because the city is so small, it buses children from a 4-county rural area. All bus drivers are given a certain section of this area and need to establish a bus route that runs in the most efficient manner to conserve gas. The children you pick up are located 4 miles north of the school, 2 miles east of the school, and 1 mile west of the school. Those are the facts. Now let me ask you those two questions. Number one, how old is the bus driver? Got it? Good. Second question, what did the bus driver have for breakfast this morning? Now, many of you might say, can you say that story again? Didn't catch those. So let me say it again. You are the bus driver. Now, how many of you got that? See, what happens here is we do selective retention as leaders and as individuals. Did you listen to all the facts? thinking I was going to ask you the facts of the story. This is the whole concept of selective retention. And as leaders, we have to be open to all types of communication. So, did you pass this test? Or do you have to prove your listening skills? Point 3 is humor. What I noticed for each of these particular leaders that I researched, that each of them had the ability to have self-deprecating humor. They had the ability to laugh at themselves. They had the ability to have a good sense of humor. And, you know, many people talk about Coach Bill Belichick. They say he's stoic. They say he doesn't say much to the media. But if you read his book and you talk to the people around him, he has the most fabulous sense of humor. Many of these leaders had that. A funny story that I researched was when Vince Lombardi was coaching the Green Bay Packers, who was the dynasty in the 1960s. They played in the famous Ice Bowl. Fabulous game. And Green Bay was coming down to make a running drive, and they called a timeout. They were on like the 1-yard line. And his quarterback, Bart Stark, came back to the sideline and said to Vince Lombardi, you know, the play that you're calling is work, but the problem is the running back cannot get traction because it's so icy out. Why don't I try to sneak it in? So Vince Lombardi looked at him and said, let's do that and get the hell out of here, because it was 16 below zero. The point is that each of these leaders have humor because humor makes someone humane. So the question is, do you have the ability to laugh at yourself? Do you have the ability to really use humor as a powerful weapon? Because it helps de-stress people. And it's an important piece of it. Because what Abraham Lincoln said, this is a fabulous quote, a good laugh is good both for the mental and physical digestion. He had the uncanny ability to ask and really had the ability to be humorous in his various meetings that he had when he was president at the White House. The question is, how are you in the humor scale as a leader? Fourth, accountability mindset. Each of these leaders had the ability to keep people accountable. Each of these leaders really looked at the fact that when they set goals and they made people who were reaching those goals accountable, and they wouldn't settle for less. You know, there's an old story about mediocrity. And one of the stories that I read was the owner of the Chicago White Sox. His name was Bill Veeck. And one of the things that he was asked many years ago was, when free agency in baseball was starting, was he concerned with the high price of athletes, the baseball players? Well, how he responded was, I am not concerned with the high price of the athletes, meaning the superstars. What he was more concerned with was the high salaries for mediocre players, or as he called it, the high price of mediocrity. He had no problem paying for the high rewards of the high superstars, but he had a real big problem dealing with mediocrity. We as leaders have to set the bar. We have to be able to raise the bar and stretch people, but keep people accountable. That's one of the things that Vince Lombardi did fabulously, was to keep his players quite accountable to what they had to achieve. So great leaders realize the power of accountability. Which leads us to point 5, or secret number 5, recognition and praise. All the leaders had the ability to praise people and recognize them in some way. They realized that people work hard. They realized that people are always striving to the goal, and they also realized that their team is striving for a goal. For people like Vince Lombardi, their players, when they would get a data boy from him, was the highest praise. There's a great story about Jerry Kramer, who was one of their guards who was actually in the Hall of Fame, and he was having a practice that was not going well. And Coach Lombardi was just leaning into him and yelling and screaming and just really made it a hell of a practice for him. So Jerry Kramer was actually in the locker room after practice, dejected as you can be. He even said to a point that he was thinking about quitting the game. Vince Lombardi came over to him afterwards, tapped him on the back, and he says, don't worry about today, because I believe you're going to be one of the best guards in NFL history. And I remember watching a documentary which Jerry Kramer said, at that point, that recognition and praise vaulted him to the places where he is today in terms of being the best player in the National Football League back then. Amazing. The power of recognition and praise. Point 6 is being flexible. Leaders understand they have to have a plan, but they do not stick to it when things change. Because after all, things are fluid. It's the ability to understand that things are fluid. And it's knowing when to change the plan. As you can tell, that Bill Belichick is known for this, that at halftime he makes these wonderful adjustments and the game plan depending on how things played out. Bill Parcells, who I also looked at, did the same thing. Each leader had that uncanny ability to realize when something wasn't working to make an adjustment. They didn't let their ego get in the way. We as leaders can get our ego in the way sometimes. Do you? Are you flexible enough to realize when something's not working? Are you flexible enough to realize that you have to change course? Effective leaders do that. And each and every one that I researched did have that uncanny ability. Point 7, and this is probably one of the biggest things that I noticed in terms of all the leaders. All the leaders were great teachers. Now, Vince Lombardi had a quote that said, "You can't coach what you can't teach." He started off as a high school teacher. He was teaching before it became known to be a teacher in the NFL. What's quite interesting about Vince Lombardi is that one of the power plays that he had was a staple of his offense was called the power sweep. Back then, no one could stop it. My research, when I looked at this, do you realize that Coach Lombardi ran a clinic in which he spent 8 hours just talking about how that play works? Imagine that, 8 hours. What he did was he was able to teach that. He had the uncanny ability to be a teacher. Another particular person who I researched was John Wooden. John Wooden is and was the UCLA college basketball coach that put UCLA on the map. They won 88 straight games. They were a dynasty in the college basketball industry. He taught people not only how to play basketball, but he taught them about life. He has a thing called the Pyramid of Life, which is something you haven't read or looked into. You should, because it really talks about how to be successful, not only in life, but as a leader. Well, what's quite fascinating about Coach Wooden is that in the first day of each practice, every year, he would bring his players to center court. Now picture this. They've won 88 straight games. He has recruited the best college basketball players in the country. These are the elite of college basketball. So what did he teach them on day one? Well, he taught them how to put their socks and sneakers on effectively. Now think about that. This is the most basic thing you can do when you play basketball. But what was he trying to teach them? His philosophy was that if you teach them how to put their socks and sneakers on, it may avoid them getting a blister. And that avoiding of a blister could make a difference when you're trying to defend somebody toward the end of the game when the game was close. It may make a difference so they could cut to the basket to score the winning basket. But a blister could affect that. He looked at every way to be a fabulous teacher. So that is probably one of the biggest leadership nuggets you can take away from today. What are you doing to be a teacher? What, as a leader, are you doing to teach the people that you're dealing with? How are you teaching them to be successful? Because all these leaders had that uncanny ability to teach others and to teach them quite successfully. Which leads us to point number 8, understanding individual capabilities. Each leader had the uncanny knack to be able to look at people and understand what they were good at. In essence, it put them in positions to succeed. When you look at the various sports coaches, they had the uncanny ability to be able to look at their various players and put them in positions where they could be successful. In other words, if they were a football player, do they stop the run better than they stop the pass? Well, let me put them in positions where they can be successful. For defining roles on the basketball team, understanding what their capabilities are, they would say, this is all I wanted you to do. It's a fabulous story about Red Auerbach and Bill Russell. When Bill Russell actually came into the NBA, one of his big concerns was that he wasn't going to score enough points. He figured that he wasn't really a point scorer, and he was really concerned on whether he would survive in the NBA. Coach Red Auerbach went up to him and said, listen, I got enough players here who can score points. I want you to rebound that ball. It's all I want you to do. And of course, the rest is history. But Red Auerbach saw the capabilities of his various players and put them in positions to succeed. As leaders, do you do that? Do you look at people that you're with and say, what do they do well, and let me put them in positions to succeed? Or do you kind of use them as all vanilla, that they all should do everything? As leaders, we see the capabilities and we put them in positions to succeed. Which leads us to point number 9, building relationships. Every leader had the uncanny ability, because they are great communicators, and open communication, to build relationships. They build relationships with their team. They build relationships with their coaches on their staff, because they realized building relationships is probably the most vital thing they can do. Because after all, dealing with people is about relationships. Being on a team is all about relationships. They also had the ability to really connect and build effective relationships. They brought people in versus repelling them out. So I ask you, as a leader, are you building relationships? Are you building the necessary relationships to be successful in your craft? Are you drawing people in, or are you repelling them out? Because the success that you have as a leader is all going to depend on the people who you lead. Do they feel that they will go through a wall for you? And if you can't answer that, that's something you need to deal with and look at as a leader. And the last point is defining team goals. One of the things that each leader really focused in on was that the team succeeds. It's all about the team, and they made sure that the team was successful. So they looked at and defined what those team goals were, and they make sure that everyone understood them. And they also made them understand how they can contribute to that team goal. So each leader not only built that vision, but each of those leaders articulated what that team goal is. But of course, in sports, it's always about winning the championships. But in the political arena or in the business world, the goals could be a whole lot different. Do you as a leader articulate what those team goals are? Do each of those members understand what those team goals are? Do they understand their contribution to those team goals? That's really some vital questions that we have to ask ourselves in relation to building team goals. Because if they don't understand their contributions nor understand the team goal, then how can they contribute to it? So there they are. What I consider to be the top 10 of probably one of the most successful leaders that I saw and read about today. What can you do in some of these areas? What are some of those points that you can develop and massage to be an effective leader? My challenge to you is to really look at these top 10 that we talked about in today's show and say to yourself, where do I rank myself on a scale of 1 to 10 in each of these particular categories? With 1 being very low, where 10 you consider yourself to be a guru. What do you do, and are there any learnings for you here today? Because what I saw from successful leaders is that this is not rocket science. There are certain principles that all successful leaders follow. And I challenge you to be able to look at those areas for yourself so you can understand how successful you can be. So that's my leadership challenge and message for you today. So again, my name is Ted Gorski. Thanks again for tuning in today's session of the Leadership Edge. If we can help you in any way, please reach out to us at www.getyouredge.com. We'd be more than happy to help you on your leadership journey. So thanks again for watching the show, and have a great day.